All right, good afternoon. Good to see you. This week, we're going to talk about our first collection of short stories written by a local writer, Brooklynite, Charles Loomis, who was born in the second half of the 19th century, died before World War I at a relatively young age. He was in his early 50s. And as a journalist, he followed the trends, the social practices that were trending during his time, including the theme of mobility. Mobility not limited to the automobile. In fact, there is a nice short story by him about somebody who stops with his horse and carriage to pick up a hitchhiker. Hitchhiking existed before the automobiles, and in fact, it was the polite thing to do if you encountered someone that looked like a peer in terms of social standing, to give them a lift. This guy, the hitchhiker, practically invites himself in the house of this man with a horse and carriage and intrudes so much into the life of this polite man that he ends up being engaged by the end of the story to the daughter of the person who gave him a ride. In this case, we have three short stories that were published in 1907 under the title of Araminta and the Automobile, but they were published in newspapers and magazines much earlier, 1900, 1902, 1903. And they're all very interesting in terms of the representation of the automobile and the narrative patterns applied to the purchase of a new technological product and its adoption. We'll also start a new film, a wonderful film, my favorite in the Transformers series, Bumblebee. 2018 is the year when it was released. In many ways, it is a modern remake of Herbie. You have a teenager who's at the end of her high school years in California, Northern California, near San Francisco in the 1980s, and she's not popular. She's not even popular within her family because she lost her father, her mother is happily remarried, and she's not fitting in her family, she's not fitting in her school. She's trying to become an adult and struggling to find somebody to support that process after she lost her father. And one of the things that brought her and her father close was the restoration of an old Corvette, which is now interrupted, and she seems unable to resume the work successfully. She ends up getting from a junkyard a Volkswagen Beetle, a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, only to find out later on that this is none other than Bumblebee, a bot, who is a sentient alien creature that came from another planet looking for home for himself and his own clan, the Autobots, that are being hunted by the evil bots called the Decepticons. And therefore, you have two people who perceive themselves as intruders in their respective environments. They haven't found their footing, their identity. An alien, an actual alien, even though it's an alien technology, and this teenager, right? And it's typical of the experience of teenagers, this sense of not feeling that you fit in. Together, interacting, getting to know each other, they will be able to go through a transformative journey. By the end of the film, Charlie will be a grown, mature, strong woman, and the bot, Bumblebee, B127 is his technical name, his original name, will be called a hero by his peers that have arrived to Earth and recognize that the mission done by Bumblebee was essential for their survival. It's a nice film, even from the point of view of cinematography, editing, etc. Today, I will go through a short series of announcements. Then I'll tell you the plots and the main themes of the 3 short stories that are in the readings. If there is time, I want to, first of all, engage in a short discussion during my presentation, and then at the end of it, if there is time, do an in-class activity. Otherwise, we can push it to Thursday. I'm in no hurry. Feel free to interrupt me with questions during the preliminary part of the class or later on. So, as you may have seen from the announcements and even from my email, the Concorso d'Eleganza organized by the Center of Italian Studies, of which I'm the director, was postponed because clearly Sunday there was a lot of rain. As a result, though, I spent, up until Friday afternoon, we were pushing through, waiting for a decision. We couldn't stop in our preparations. When we decided to call it off, we have to undo it. Call every one of the 75 participants, post online everywhere that this was postponed, reach out to campus police, campus media. On Sunday morning, I was here on campus because the last time we canceled in 2023, at least one of the cars showed up. Some of the people, the public from the community showed up. So I thought it was the courteous thing to do to be there. Now, if you're free, I invite you again to come Sunday. Of course, we'll confirm by Thursday if the weather holds. It seems to be sunny for next weekend in the forecasts. So if you're free, come. The place is the same, parking lot 2 between Wine Center and Tubman Hall. And the time is between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. But don't come towards the end of that time because by 12:30 some of the cars are trying to leave because people come from New Jersey, from the city for this, from the Hamptons, and then they go have lunch somewhere. This is the car that won Best Choice Popular Prize. It's a De Tomaso Pantera from 1987. There were some objections to this choice, especially by the vintage car owners, because this is not a vintage car, it's a resto mode, meaning that some of the parts are modern. The entire car is not original, but it's a beautiful sports car, a joint venture between an Italian-Argentinian car maker, Alejandro De Tomaso, and the engine was, in fact, an American engine, and it was popular during the 1970s and 80s in the US. Not a great car for reliability, but for looks, cannot be beaten. I want to remind you that I haven't posted yet because of how busy I was with doing and undoing the Concorso, the video from Thursday's class. So if you missed that class, be patient. Although on Thursday of last week, we spent most of the time watching scenes from the film The Love Bag and doing an in-class activity. You find the film on numerous platforms, streaming. It might be a good idea for you to find it and watch those scenes. Also, I want to remind you that for some of the readings, for example, those assigned during week 1 and 2, you find comprehensive lectures in the videos from the past, right? So in this case, during this semester, I just summarized some of the main points, but if you want to have a more detailed illustration of the presentations and the readings, you can go and find them on the videos posted on the class website. Also, I didn't have time to look at your assignments. I extended the deadline exactly because I knew I wouldn't have time to work on them, but I haven't had the time yet to check on your posting of the assignments and start reviewing and correcting them. I'll do that as soon as possible. If you encountered any technical issues, just let me know. If you posted past the deadline into Monday morning or afternoon, it'll be fine this time since I didn't have time to check. Otherwise, normally the morning after the deadline, when I wake up, I check the website to make sure that every assignment was posted. All you have to do to post the assignment is put it on the Google Docs file that was shared with you. You don't have to send me an email or a copy of the assignment, because again, I can check those files were shared between each one of you and myself, so I can open all of them and check on the submission. It's not, there are 31 students in the class, so it's not impossible. Okay, so this presentation that I'll be using today can be found under week 3, and you find the title there. There is a page that includes the actual short stories, and then there is another page, which is this one, with notes about those stories and a series of documents, links about the material technologies described in here, because it's not necessarily a generic inclusion of the automobile in the short stories. They're referring to specific models and specific technologies. So in general, not just for the short stories that we'll be reading and discussing this week, but in general, during this period and later on, when a narrative or a narrative from a short story, a novel, a film focuses on a technology, and that's certainly true for the automobile, it's true in part for the plane and other technologies, often you find this kind of narrative pattern with a structure with 3 parts. The first part, which can be short in some cases, longer in others, I call the anticipation. This is the part before the main characters purchase the automobile or come into contact with a form of technology. We'll see after this a science fiction novel with a vehicle that is able to go on the road, in the air, on top of the water, and deep into the water. So it's a combination automobile, plane, submarine, and ship. So the first part is before coming into contact with the technology. In this part, usually, for these kinds of stories, the technology is still present in the form of premonitions or hopes, right? The characters are hoping to get this product, to add it to their lives. They're hoping that the product will change their lifestyle, perhaps change their identity, because it'll change the way they see and experience life. There might be fears also, because the technology is unknown, unproven, might be unreliable, might be threatened to change the way of life. After all, we are talking about a period when automobiles, during the years between 1900 and 1903, were still rare, but it was clear that the entire ecosystem of countries such as the US and other countries would change with the introduction of mechanized vehicles, right? And society would be impacted. And there might be signs, that is to say, there might be perceptions or small experiences that provide a sense of what is about to happen, whether it be positive and negative. The second part in these narratives, whether it be a book or a film, I call the immersion. That is to say, that's not only when the technology comes into play in the story, but that's also when the characters plunge entirely into the experience of the technology. It could be an indirect experience, that is to say, the characters are simply exposed to the technology. They haven't purchased, they're not using, They're just passengers, not drivers, but they're being exposed to this mobility device. And very common in the culture of that time, but applicable to other technologies as well, the idea of rapture. That is to say, the idea that after coming into contact with the technology takes hold of your life. And that's true even of the film Bumblebee that we'll see this week and the next week. It's even more true of the film after that, which is a nice horror film from the 1980s called Christine, with a sentient diabolical car that practically enslaves the mind of its young car owner, another teenager in high school, to the point that by the end of the film, this young teenager will be like a minion to the evil car, helping the evil car complete their mission. Rapture means that you're completely absorbed, that your entire life is reduced to the experience of the automobile. There is no room for anything else in your mind. And rapture means that the experience itself is hard to process rationally. That the first reactions induced by the experience of this technology, in our case, the automobile, is visceral, is at the level of the biological functions of your body, the nervous system, before you can entertain a real reflection on it. Through the first and the second part, or sometimes just within the second part, you usually can find on the page or the screen the themes of seduction and temptation. That is to say, the characters are tempted to give in to the technology and embrace the change. But they might seem seduction is the positive, temptation is the positive mixed with the negative. Temptation means they might still feel hesitant about embracing the technology, about just embracing their powerful reactions and being completely taken and absorbed by the technology. Temptation also refers to the fact that during this period, there is often a moralistic view of the adoption of a technology. And that's an interesting theme for us, because at this point, we've lost the sense that we as citizens, we as a society, have power. We have the power to accept or reject a technology. We tend to see ourselves just as consumers. Now, take a modern counterpart, a modern counterexample that would be parallel to the adoption of the automobile, the adoption of artificial intelligence. Has society as a whole, have you as members of this society ever considered whether this technology should be adopted, should be accepted, or is it too dangerous? And certainly you must have heard people expressing their hopes, high hopes for this technology, right? AI will find the cure for cancer. AI will generate wealth. AI will free you from manual labor in the form of humanoids, human-shaped androids. You've heard the fears, right? Saying AI will become more intelligent than humanity, and then you have scenarios as those that you've seen in numerous movies where an army of bots or computers take over humanity or enter into a war, a global conflict with humans. And certainly you've seen signs, right? You sense that things could go in different ways, that jobs could be lost, or more positive changes could come. And clearly, we've been all seduced by AI. Just consider how quickly, when OpenAI opened their free app website, how quickly their membership, their base grew from zero into hundreds of millions of users. it was just a matter of months, right? This was unprecedented, even beat the numbers, the previous records held by Facebook. And temptation, you know about temptation with AI, right? You are being tempted to write every assignment with AI, and you know, however, what the consequences might be. So, seduction and temptation can be spread through the first and the second part of these narratives. And within the second part and spanning towards the third part, there might be, not necessarily, but there might be, even though rapture is this psychophysical absorption, this biological involvement, there might be some reflections. That is to say, the character might stop. This happens in the science fiction book, to say, well, but what is really going on? Is this right? Should I be pursuing this? Should I be, in the case of this character, John Schrock, switching from the side of the good guys as an FBI, a federal agent? They don't say FBI, of course. It's too early for that. And go work for the evil scientist who's invented this mobility miracle that's called the terror. The last part is transformation. Of course, transformation is happening in the second part as well, but I call the third act transformation simply because by this time the transformation of the main characters, positive or negative, is evident, has been completed. And the consequences, the outcome of the transformation could be adoption of the technology. From that point on, the technology enters the life of the characters. But mind you, there is a subtle difference, because any kind of instrument or product from the past would have entered the lives of the purchasers, of the owners and the consumers, right? Whether it be an article of clothing or a hammer, a carriage, a new horse. But in this case, adoption means that the technology occupies a central position within the life, the new life of the consumer or owner of the technology, and informs their life from that point on. And of course, the modern example of that would be the smartphone, right? So accepting to adopt the smartphone for users and owners from the early 2000s and 2010 meant that they would be having their cell phone on them or within 10, 20 inches from their body 24/7, right? Interestingly, during this period, as opposed to what is happening right now, rejection is sometimes the outcome. And we talked about the fact that within the language of the introduction of the technology of the automobile in society, enemies of the automobile, friends of the automobiles were common phrases, because there were a lot of people who simply said, we don't need this. It is not significantly more efficient than whatever we've had so far, and the risks coming with it are too strong in terms of what are we going to lose? We're going to lose in terms of noise, pollution, traffic accident, etc., etc. Whether adoption or rejection is the outcome in these kinds of narratives, often the implied discovery, realization, is that the technology introduced at the beginning of the book or the film has created a disruption. That the world, even though the individual character may have rejected the technology, that this technology is going to have a disruptive effect on society, on the world, that there is no coming back from that. And that's very true of the science fiction book about this vehicle, the Terror, that flies, goes on the road, on the sea, under the sea, that even though the technology is destroyed at the end, there is this sense that it'll come back, that the world is not innocent, that the world has lost its innocence, right? And consider what is going on even today. Now, we're just during the last 18 months, I believe, 18 to 24 months, we're seeing a small uptick in people who are saying, I've stopped using my cell phone, or I'm using my cell phone as little as possible, right? That's a new phenomenon, but clearly it's not nearly enough to revert to a pre-smartphone society or lifestyle, right? So consider this part of the class something that you should have in mind when you read other texts as well, not just the short stories by Loomis, when you look at films, because this produces a matrix that can be superimposed on a number of stories and films, and maybe not all of these sub-elements will be represented, but the global pattern, the overall pattern will be there. Now, before I proceed, I already mentioned AI, I mentioned the smartphone a little bit. Do you see this kind of pattern in modern stories or modern practices related to different technologies? And I'm not talking about the automobile, the modern automobile in this case, unless you want to entertain this discussion about the electric cars and various electric vehicles. Comments, input about this kind of pattern found in either fiction, non-fiction, or in real life in our societies. But again, the key aspect is the mindset of the user. Is the user behaving like a consumer? I buy or I don't buy. I subscribe, I don't subscribe. And when has the mindset shifted from I'm not just a consumer, I'm also a citizen? Is this a good thing for our society? And where is a forum, a social forum, where citizens discuss what to do about this? And instead, it's just whatever money can buy in terms of investment and development goes on, and society follows, but follows with a consumer's mindset rather than a citizen's mindset. Because a citizen's mindset would be, I have some authority over this matter through my vote, through my voice, etc. And that has apparently disappeared, largely disappeared. Some of this we've already touched. This idea that at the turn of the century, between the 19th and the 20th century, culture is influenced by consumption. That is to say, people have always bought products. But then, at that period, during that period of time, books, theater, films, when the films come out, talk about purchasing stuff and the consequences of having products in your life, right? So consumption becomes a social and a cultural phenomenon at the same time that goes beyond just the need. For example, we have anecdotal evidence that people in large metropolitan areas have in my database an article from London. People notice that even those who are not particularly rich, people from the lower or the middle classes, will have at least one fancy item of clothes. It could just be an umbrella or gloves that are more expensive than they could normally afford, because they can afford that item, and that item for them is a gateway experience into the dream of becoming richer, which is so very typical of us, right? Whereas in the past, you would spend more or less at the level of your social class. So capitalism used to be, before the end of the 19th century, about production of goods and the sale of goods. Those were the key functions in the existence of a capitalist society. And then from the turn of the century, between the 19th and the 20th, consumer is the most important role. Consumption is the most important function, right? If you stop consuming, then society is doomed. That's the message. In fact, 20 or 30 years ago, people, politicians, intellectuals started talking about universal basic income. Have you heard about universal basic income? Even some presidential candidates routinely mention this idea. It has been tried in Europe in several countries. It's the idea that even if people are unemployed, they should receive money to purchase stuff, because without that influx of consumers, the market will not do well, and society as a whole will precipitate in a recession, in a crisis from which there is no recovery. Consumer is also the major role for a character or for a person, rather than being a person, a citizen, a member of the family, right? And in fact, divorce, the idea of a stronger push towards divorce happens from the last part of the 19th century. We'll find that in one of the books, a wonderful novel by a female writer from Chicago, who was also an actress in New York City, called A Motor Car Divorce, where divorce itself becomes an object to consume, to purchase, to get for oneself. But the idea of divorce, which of course is a right, is a basic right, but at the same time, from the point of view of a consumerist society, the idea is that if the family acts as one unit, discussing big item purchases like an automobile, a house, etc., a big vacation, then you sell less. If you break down the family, then you have multiple minds who could get into consumption, right? If the family acts as one, then out of 4 people or 5 people, you may have 1 purchaser or 0. But if you break that unit into 5 consumers, then 3 out of 5, 2 out of 5 could purchase something, and the economy grows as a consequence. Consumption used to be mostly about the need. I need something, and then the idea shifts towards quality of life. It's not so much that I need this item because it will make the quality of life better, right? Every object, every item we buy becomes about lifestyle. Whether the clothes that are more comfortable and you'll be seen, whether it be a mobility device, electric scooter, a bicycle, a motorcycle, everything is about lifestyle. Customization becomes a thing, right? And customization is just a marketing ploy. The idea that I can buy something and make it unique, so it'll be different from the next person, and therefore it will add more quality to me as a person, to my life. And the shift, finally, from the desire, I want to buy something, to urge, using marketing strategies to make it so that I'm not content. I have a state of anxiety and agitation until I've made this purchase, right? Which, in terms of the pattern that we saw before, it could be you start reviewing about your next phone, right? You start reading reviews because you want to make an informed decision, you don't want to waste your money. But soon, review after review, your mind shifts from the idea that one of these phones could be your next phone as a wise choice, into, oh my God, what can I do without it? How can I go on without this phone once you've made this decision? And you notice that in a lot of marketing campaigns or in simple tricks that are being used to sell you stuff, right? Let's talk briefly about the stories. The first one, they all have couples, right? The protagonists are couples. In the first story, you have Araminta, the wife, and her husband, who doesn't have a name. And they're living in the suburbs of New York City. He's commuting to work using the train. So imagine, they don't specify the geography, but imagine him living in New Jersey, getting on the train to go into the city for a middle to upper class professional job. He decides that he would be better off without taking the train because he doesn't like people, doesn't like reading or playing cards, which were things that people would do at that point in trains. And people have been getting together on the subway or the Long Island Railroad train in the same car, playing cards up until 10 or 15 years ago. You would see these groups, they would try to find each other and then spend time playing cards or socializing. So the car is delivered to them because that's how the purchase went. You would go for a demo ride. The car during the demo ride would be driven by an employee of the dealership. The dealership could be called agency during that time. And after you made your purchase, a new car would be delivered to you, and the employee handling the delivery would also be tasked with teaching you how to drive the car. Of course, somebody from middle upper class, like the husband in this story, gets a simple employee from the dealership who's coming there to teach him how to drive the car, and he says, I don't need it. Experience is the best teacher. So he gets into the car and tells Araminta, get ready to get on board and we'll go for a ride. But then he proceeds to destroy part of the house. He destroys a small barn in his garden, the fence, a veranda. Finally, he can get his wife on board, and his wife is pretty skeptical. Often in these stories, the wives are the voice of reason. They go out their neighborhood, on their neighbor road, and in the direction of the next town. And the story continues with this state of complete loss of control. The husband is not able to steer the car properly, and therefore they have a constant series of accidents, one more ridiculous than the next. At some point, they get into an accident with the carriage where the small coach, where the doctor, the rural doctor is, and the doctor gets on the car itself, and they say, oh, okay. And then the doctor slides off the car, and they say, okay, we'll have to change doctors, clearly. And they continue on, but the whole experience is both rapture and loss of control, and at the same time, chaos. Yes?
Could you just lower the blinds in there, please? It's
Yep.
very loud.
Sure.
Thank you.
In the second story, you find a richer couple. They're definitely upper class. Again, they're living outside the city. John and Martha. John would like to get an automobile. This idea has crossed his mind. This is a desire. But he knows that his wife, and they've talked about it, wouldn't like that kind of purchase because Martha is, in fact, very much in love with horses. She loves horse riding. She loves having a carriage and a horse. So at some point, John comes out with an idea. He will purchase an automobile, an electric one. He will attach to this automobile a fake horse. He will put a sound device with the sound of a galloping horse. And he will take his wife on board. Now, I should have added that the execution of this plan happens at a time when poor Martha is suffering from some kind of oak poison in her eyes. And as it was customary during the period, the doctor has prescribed some ointment for the eyes and thick dark lenses to rest the eyes. So she can see the profile of things, but she cannot see very, very well. So he tells her, I'm taking you for a ride on your new carriage. And she's very happy, and she has no reason to believe otherwise. They get onto this car, and it's a peculiar car. I'll show you pictures of cars during that period that actually resemble a carriage, where the driver was behind the passengers. He pretends that this person who has delivered the car and who will take them for this demo ride is one of their valet. And out they go. in this ridiculous contraption, but I'll show you that this contraption, no matter how ridiculous, reflected actual ideas from that time. Again, the experience is complete loss of control up until the point where they have an accident. The wife is thrown out of the car. He fears for her life. The driver on the back also falls off. And at the end, John tells the man from the dealership, okay, take the car, take it back to the dealership, because clearly my wife will be angry at me, realizing what's happening. And instead, Martha provides a favorable assessment of what happened to them, and they decide to adopt the automobile. The final reflection is, this car is dangerous, but not as dangerous as regular carriages can be. And therefore, this couple will embrace the automobile. Final story. Orville is a bachelor in New York writing self-help books, like Thinking for Non-Thinkers. He's made some money. He's in his late 20s, ready economically, financially, socially, to get married. He has met through other friends Annette, who's a young woman from the Midwest who's come to visit her aunt in New York City. It's Christmas. Orville is invited to a Christmas dinner, and this will be the occasion when he will approach Annette and make his declaration, right? Give her the ring, even though it's a very Victorian romance, right? They haven't had a relationship, they've just known each other, but he thinks it's the appropriate kind of husband for her, etc. Has to happen on Christmas, because after Christmas, she's boarding a ship to go to Europe, as young American women from wealthy families would do, for the grand tour, to learn about society, perhaps find a husband. She's going to Paris, so this has to happen at Christmas. He goes to buy a ring, goes back to his apartment to change and get ready, but he slips on a banana peel and hurts his foot. So he cannot, even though the dinner Annette's aunt's house is not too far in the upper part of Manhattan, he cannot walk there, and he calls a taxi cab. It's from the year 1900, as I told you. By 1918, 98, and 99 in New York City, electric taxi cabs became common. So a taxi cab, electric one, comes to pick up Orville. And we'll see what kind of vehicle it is. And when they get the driver and his passenger to the house where the dinner is hosted, the car doesn't brake. The brakes are broken. The driver simply tells him there is no way to stop this vehicle. We'll drive around the block, because this is an electric vehicle, until the battery is fully discharged. And he says, this battery was not fully charged, so it will be just a matter of time. And around and round they go. Clearly, Orville would like to jump off, because it's getting late. He's afraid Annette might leave, or who knows. But his hurt foot prevents him, and the liability. The driver says, if you hurt yourself, then my company will be liable. You cannot do that. At some point, the guests in this townhouse realize what is going on, because Orville is screaming at them. So they all go to the front of the house. They see him pass, and there is this kind of circus. First of all, a guest by the name of Joe jumps on the taxi cab driver to give him some food, because he's going around and he hasn't had anything to eat. Then finally, because the car is not stopping, Annette herself jumps on the car, because she's a new woman. New woman being a label used at the time for a feminist. A woman who's not afraid to be physical, is not afraid to be courageous, or to do something that others might see as inappropriate for a proper woman. She gets on the car because she probably understands the situation, right? And right when Orville is getting the ring out and proposing to her, the car finally stops, is out of charge in front of the house. They all clap. And the only issue is that he tells her they'll go to Paris together as soon as his foot is recovered, right, on their honeymoon. So, as you can see, loss of control, rupture is present in all three of the stories. There is a premise to the encounter with the technology. There are some hints to the future. We know that this couple will continue to use the technology. We don't know about the other two couples. We can presume the first one perhaps will, but it's not completely sure, right? And so in these stories, clearly you have a before, a during, and an aftermath. Before is imagining how their lives will be with the automobile. The symbiotic relationship is the idea that this technology will enter their lives and will not be just used part of the time, but will change their ecosystem. That's a very important concept, right? There is an individual ecosystem or a family ecosystem, there is a social ecosystem, meaning that you see reality through your technologies, right? The technology becomes a filter, but it's always there with you. There are some social considerations. There is the experience of the purchase, which is interesting that a fiction story would have the story of how an item was purchased and customized. During is all about loss of control, distraction, a soul transformation, the experience transforming, but in a negative way, right? You're losing also your soul. You're captive to the technology. There's the experience of speed. And remember how important is this gesture in the context of that society, that this woman from an upper class family decides to jump on a car, and it's symbolic. The aftermath, it's not always clear whether the couples will continue to use the technology. Notice the detached tone, especially in the women or other characters who have a negative attitude towards the technology. There is the possibility not just of continuation, but of separation from the technology. But the world has lost its innocence. Mobility will not be the same after that. And now I'll jump these and I'll just look with you at some of the illustrations. So we were talking about the second story, Martha and John, and this crazy idea by John. He goes to a store selling horse riding equipment, and to advertise themselves, they have this fake horse, and he purchases the horse, he puts it in between two poles, attaches it to the car. But in fact, we know that at the turn of the century, a patent was recorded with this idea, and reasoning was applied to that. The idea being, let's attach a fake horse's head in front of a self-propelled vehicle. So this is not a carriage. This is a carriage with an engine. So it's a rudimentary automobile. And the idea was that if you sell this item, because a lot of automakers during this period were just assembling cars. So they would purchase the chassis, the engine from other producers, then they would do the body. So the idea from this person who had this patent registered was to sell this. And the idea was that psychologically people will be reassured, that people are afraid of the car, are afraid of losing control, but if they see the horse's head in front of them, this will soothe their anxiety. So they thought this was a good way to create a kind of friendly interface to the technology of the automobile. Isn't that incredible that this existed, that this idea existed? This is the magazine where the story of Annette and Orville was published, and I want to show you the illustrations. This is an actual taxi cab, electric taxi cab from New York City around the year 1899, 1900s, and I'll show you pictures later. But of course, I want to point out that you have the driver sitting high up on top. The engine would be in this box. The front would be reserved to the passenger with full view of the road and easy access because there would be two doors. In the back, you see Cupid, because in this story, and later on in entire novels in a genre called motor romance, the idea is that there might be couples that fall in love thanks to the technology. And again, this was repeated, right? Think of couples getting married after meeting with a dating app, etc. So you find all kinds of situations in modern society where technologies are mediating the creation of a relationship. You find the same in the following page, the same kind of vehicle, right? This is Orville getting agitated, and you find kids following, chasing the car. After all, this taxi cab probably had a speed of around 10, 15 miles per hour, could be slower, and so it was not impossible to run after that. But anecdotal evidence we have is that kids themselves were friends or enemies of the automobile. The kids would either get very excited or even try to hitch a ride on an automobile because they'd never been, or they would throw rocks or play pranks in front of automobiles. In the motor car romance, they tell us that in Italy, where the characters go, and this is based on a true trip made by the writer, by Louise, in Italy, she tells us that in Naples, kids would throw a jacket or a coat in front of an automobile to make the driver believe they'd run over a kid. Okay, so there were really acts of sabotage against this technology. Again, something that we're not completely familiar with. This is the first guest, Joe, and Joe is anti-technology. Joe, during dinner, while Orville is late, and everybody's wondering, why is Orville late? He's not the kind of guest to arrive late at a formal Christmas dinner. Joe says, oh, Orville might be dead. Because these days, there are so many ways to die. You can die in an elevator, you can die in an automobile, and he lists all the technologies that can kill you. But he will be one to jump on board. You see the shape of the taxi cab in front. And this is the small pot with some food for the poor Orville. And this, of course, is the illustration of the proposal. However, keep in mind that the illustrator hasn't understood the character. The illustrator painted Annette very bashful, very shy, like a proper Victorian woman, whereas the short story by someone with a good sense of how society was evolving, like Loomis, portrayed her as a proto-feminist, as someone who's not just waiting, being passive, but a woman that takes the initiative, a woman that thinks that being physical is not inappropriate even if you are a member of the upper class, right? And this is the proposal itself, the line underneath. These are some images of the actual taxi cab circulating in New York City and other towns. And it was a fairly advanced system because something that has been tried in Korea and very few other places, I believe, but should be reconsidered. When the batteries were down, the taxi cab would go back to its hub, to its central hub, where they would have charged batteries. The batteries would just be replaced. So this taxi cab could reach its hub and be out again in 10, 15 minutes without waiting for the car to recharge, right? And something like that in our time could be automated, right? Whereas you stop, there is a mechanical, a robotic arm that extracts a battery from the side of your car, puts a new one, and you'll be out in less than a minute, the same way that a gas refueling would take, right? Because the problem with electric cars is not that you don't find enough charging stations, right? Even on Long Island, which is in the United States, one of the places, together with California, with the highest concentration, Suffolk County, of electric cars, you find very few pumping charging station, electric charging station, but the problem is that you have to stop for 10, 20, 30 minutes if you have fast charging, or hours if you have slower charging. Therefore, a single station cannot serve 5 to 10,000 cars like a regular gas station. Okay, so you see the driver high up, the engine in here. This is where you step and you open these doors and you sit in front. There is room for 1 or 2 people there. But the illustration you saw from the magazine was actually an illustration of this particular vehicle precisely, right? And in reference to the contraption custom made for John in the second story, look at this. This vehicle that was sold in the early 1900s looks exactly like a traditional carriage, with rubber instead of wood on the wheels, with room in front, comfortable space for the passengers, but the steering wheel, the driver, is supposed to be in the back, as you find in the story. So use these images when you read the story to understand it fully. And again, the engine here is electric because it was reliable, there was no noise, no smell, and it was fine. Range was limited, but people were not looking to go out for 30 or 60 miles or tremendous speeds. And they continue to make these, right? Again, this is an even larger carriage, engine in the back. The driver sits up high. This time they just have a bar, a handle bar, not a steering wheel. And the passengers, the master and his wife, would be in front. And I provided an example. In this case, the steering wheel is in front, but it's still very much like a carriage of the past. And you see this upper class couple with a valet and a driver. The valet would come down to open the doors for them, right? But this is the idea of a luxury vehicle for an upper class couple, right? I think it was a politician, somebody who served as governor. I'm not sure this is New York City, but somewhere in the Northeast. Goes to the actual reading. This presentation here, Araminta and the Automobile, where you find the short stories. I would like you to form groups of 3 or 4 people and read together just one of the stories and write down a few comments or observations about the stories based on the kind of matrix that I introduced at the beginning of this class. Okay. So use this. We don't have a lot of time, so it's not like you have to complete a full analysis of the story. But use these 3 acts as your table: anticipation, immersion, transformation, and find elements in one of the story, focus on just one for the sake of time, that you can put under these sections. Of course, you don't have to put it horizontal, it could be vertical, it doesn't matter how you format it. But use this matrix to find relevant elements that fall within this schema or even that are outside of this schema and are however relevant as well, okay? So again, I think it would work best if you form a group, so you engage the help of other people to complete this, and then whatever you write could be the group. I want each one of you to write on their page, but whatever you write could be the group thinking, the findings of the group. Yes, nice.
Is the attendance sheet going on?
Oh yeah, I'll send it out now. Okay, there it is.
Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me. Okay, of course I'm here to help find the actual stories, not my notes. There is a page with the actual stories. Pick one based on my introduction of the story. The first one would be Martha and her husband. The second one is one with a fake horse. And the third one is about the guy going round and round on this broken electric taxi cab before he proposes. Okay?